It was almost sunset when I finally found the place, an old colonial-style house sitting quietly at the end of a narrow street. The world around it seemed to move fast, cars rushing by, voices echoing from nearby apartments. Yet this house felt like it belonged to another time. Its porch light flickered gently, like it was waiting for someone to arrive. Maybe me. When the door opened, I froze. She stood there, the landlady, maybe in her early 40s, dressed simply but with a kind of effortless grace that drew the air toward her. A soft beige cardigan, hair loosely tied, and eyes that looked like they had seen too much but still managed to stay warm. She smiled, and something about that smile, measured, calm, slightly curious, made me forget the words I practiced. "You must be here for the room," she said. Her voice had a depth to it, low, steady, the kind that made silence feel safe. I nodded, stepping inside. The faint scent of sandalwood and something floral, maybe her perfume, hung in the air. The living room was neat but lived in, full of quiet details. Framed art, books stacked on a coffee table, a small lamp casting golden light against the walls. There was no trace of chaos, only a kind of order that spoke of someone who found comfort in control. She walked ahead of me, leading me up the staircase. I noticed the way she moved, deliberate, unhurried, as though she'd already learned the value of taking her time. "You'll like this room," she said, glancing back with a soft smile. "It catches the morning light." The room was simple, wooden floor, a wide window overlooking the street, white curtains fluttering gently. Empty, but peaceful. I imagined what it would feel like waking up there. I imagined her voice echoing from downstairs. I shouldn't have, but I did. She turned toward me, her arms crossed lightly. "So what do you do?" We talked, nothing serious, just small talk about my work, where I grew up, what brought me here. But her questions weren't casual. They were searching, like she wanted to understand not just what I did, but who I was. There were pauses, comfortable ones. She had this way of looking at me after every answer, her gaze lingering just a moment too long before she looked away. Not bold, just quietly observing. At one point, she brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, her fingers trembling slightly. It was such a small gesture, but it stayed with me, that mixture of confidence and something unspoken beneath it. When she finally said, "You seem like someone who'll take care of the place," I caught the faintest hint of a smile in her eyes. I thanked her and turned to leave, but as I reached the door, she said softly, "You can move in any time." The tone of her voice lingered, not just an offer, but an opening. Something in the air shifted, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I'd stepped into a place that might change more than just my address. I was ready to thank her and leave when she said it, that simple, disarming line that somehow felt like an invitation into another world. "You must be tired," she said softly. "Sit for a moment. Let me make you some coffee before you go." There was no reason to refuse. Still, something in her voice, the gentleness, the way she didn't wait for my answer before heading to the kitchen, made it impossible to say no. I followed her, hesitantly, into the warm glow of a space that felt far more personal than the rest of the house. Her kitchen was small but beautiful. Old wooden cabinets, the faint smell of cinnamon, a window half fogged by the evening chill. The radio played faint jazz, low enough to blend into the sound of her stirring sugar into 2 mugs. The light above the counter painted her hair with a soft, golden hue, and for a moment, I forgot to breathe. She handed me a mug with a smile. "You take sugar?" I nodded, and our fingers brushed briefly as I reached for it. The touch was accidental, but the warmth from it stayed far longer than it should have. We sat across from each other at the small dining table. At first, the conversation was polite, questions about work, the neighborhood, my plans. But as minutes slipped by, formality gave way to something else. She laughed when I told her about the first apartment I ever rented, a shoebox that leaked every time it rained. Her laughter was low and genuine, the kind that fills a room without trying. "I remember those days," she said, her voice softening, "when you think you can build your life anywhere, until you realize it's not the walls that matter, it's the peace inside them." There was a quiet ache in her tone. She spoke of her late husband, not with sorrow, but with a kind of calm acceptance that only comes after years of carrying something heavy. "It's been a while," she murmured, staring at the coffee steam. The house felt too big after he was gone. Renting it out seemed easier than feeling alone in every corner. Something in me stirred. Empathy, maybe, or the strange sense that I'd just seen a side of her few people had. She wasn't just a landlady renting out rooms. She was someone trying to fill silence with conversation, to replace ghosts with presence. At one point, she stood to pour more coffee, and as she leaned past me, her hand brushed my wrist, light, brief, but deliberate enough that it froze me in place. She didn't notice, or pretended not to. I caught the faint scent of her perfume, jasmine mixed with something warmer, maybe amber, and it lingered long after she stepped away. When I finally stood to leave, she walked me to the door. "It's nice having company," she said softly, "even for a little while." Her eyes met mine, steady but kind, and in that gaze was something I couldn't quite name. A question, maybe, or a warning. As I stepped out into the cool night air, the scent of her kitchen still clinging to my clothes, I realized something strange. I'd come looking for a room, but somehow I'd already left a part of myself behind in that house. The day I moved in, the sun was high and the street unusually quiet. I stood at her front gate with a suitcase in one hand, feeling a mixture of relief and nervous anticipation. It wasn't just another move. Something about this house, about her, made it feel different. Like I wasn't just walking into a new address, but into a chapter one didn't quite understand yet. When she opened the door, her expression softened instantly. "You're early," she said, smiling in that easy, composed way of hers. I like that. She was dressed casually, a soft gray sweater, her hair tied up loosely. There was no effort to impress, yet everything about her drew attention effortlessly. She helped me carry a few boxes inside, insisting despite my protests. Her laughter came lightly when I told her I could manage. "I know," she said, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, "but sometimes it's nice to feel useful." Inside, the house smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood. She had left the window of my room open. Sunlight filtered through white curtains, dancing across the floor. "I thought you'd like some fresh air," she said from the doorway. "Makes the place feel alive." As I unpacked, I could hear her moving around downstairs, the clinking of cups, the hum of her voice talking to someone on the phone, the sound of her laughter slipping faintly through the walls. Every sound felt strangely comforting, like the house had finally found its rhythm again. By evening, she called out, "Dinner's ready. If you don't mind something simple." I followed the smell of sautéed vegetables and warm bread into the kitchen. The table was set for two. I hesitated at first. It wasn't part of the arrangement, but she smiled reassuringly. "It's boring eating alone," she said, and that was reason enough. We ate together, and conversation flowed more easily this time. She asked about my work, my family, what made me choose this city. I asked about the house, and her eyes softened when she talked about restoring it. How every corner carried story. "It's strange," she said, resting her chin on her hand. "You spend years building something, and one day it's too quiet to stand." There was a silence after that. Not heavy, just intimate. The kind that fills with unspoken thoughts. Later that night, I passed her in the hallway. She was carrying a book, her hair down now, framing her face softly. "Good night," she said with a faint smile, her voice low, almost a whisper. "Good night," I replied, but my heart didn't settle. As I lay in bed, I could still smell her perfume, faint, comforting, familiar. Over the next few days, a quiet rhythm took hold. Morning greetings over tea, shared smiles when we crossed paths in the kitchen, brief conversations that lingered longer than necessary. The distance between landlady and tenant blurred, not in words, but in presence. Sometimes, I'd hear her humming softly downstairs or catch her watching the rain from the balcony. And though we barely touched, I could feel something forming, invisible but undeniable. It wasn't romance, not yet. It was connection, quiet, unspoken, growing stronger with every passing day. It started with a sudden drop in temperature, the kind that turns the evening air heavy and electric. By nightfall, the sky had split open, pouring rain in sheets that hammered the windows. I sat at my desk upstairs, pretending to read, but the sound of thunder and the rhythmic patter of rain made it hard to focus. The house creaked faintly in the storm, and somewhere below, I heard footsteps. A soft knock followed. When I opened the door, she was standing there, candle in hand, light flickering across her face. "The power's out," she said, her voice calm but softer than usual. "You okay up here?" Her presence filled the doorway like warmth spilling into a cold room. I nodded, and she smiled faintly. "Come downstairs. It's warmer there." In the living room, the candlelight painted golden circles on the walls. The rain outside felt distant here, like the world had shrunk down to this quiet, glowing space. She placed the candle on the table, then sat on the couch, patting the spot beside her. "It feels strange being alone in the dark," she said, almost like a confession. I sat beside her, careful not to be too close, but even then, I could feel the warmth radiating from her. She looked different in that dim light, softer, younger somehow, though her eyes still carried the calm of someone who'd weathered too many storms. We talked to fill the silence. About random things, music, travel, her garden, my job. But the conversation kept drifting toward deeper places, as if the darkness gave us permission to be honest. "Do you ever feel," she said quietly, "like you're living someone else's life?" "Ich glänzte her." "All the time." She smiled sadly. "Me too." Her voice broke slightly on the last word. A silence followed, gentle, not awkward, just the sound of rain and the faint flicker of flame between us. She looked down at her hands resting on her lap, and I noticed how still she became, like she was holding back a thought she didn't want to release. Then she spoke again, almost in a whisper. "I used to hate nights like this. They remind me of the things I can't go back to." Without thinking, I said, "Maybe that's why you opened your house to others. To fill the space those things left behind." Her eyes lifted to mine, surprised at first, then thoughtful. She didn't answer. Instead, she reached out slowly, resting her hand over mine. Her skin was cool from the candlelight, her touch feather-light but steady. For a moment, neither of us moved. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of everything we couldn't say. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky, and the rain began to ease. Inside, it felt as though the storm had shifted, no longer outside the walls, but somewhere between us. When she finally withdrew her hand, she smiled faintly. "Thank you for the company," she said, her voice barely audible. That night, when I went back upstairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, subtly, irrevocably. Like the rain had washed away whatever distance was left between us. The morning after the storm felt unusually still. The air was fresh, scented faintly with rain and wet earth drifting through the half-open windows. I went downstairs expecting the house to feel the same, but it didn't. Something was different. It was in the way her footsteps moved across the floor, the quiet pauses between words, the way her eyes lingered for a second too long when she greeted me. "Morning," she said softly, pouring coffee into 2 cups. "Did you sleep well?" "I tried," I replied, managing a smile. Her lips curved slightly. "Storm kept you up?" I wanted to tell her it wasn't the storm. It was the memory of her hand resting over mine, the warmth that had followed me long after she left the room. But I just nodded instead, and she didn't press further. We ate breakfast together at the kitchen table, quietly, almost shyly. Every movement felt careful, deliberate. When our eyes met, we both looked away, smiling to hide something neither of us was ready to name. It wasn't tension in the awkward sense. It was gentler, like the moment before music begins. The rest of the day passed in a blur of normalcy that didn't feel normal anymore. I helped her move a few boxes to the storage room, fixed a shelf that had been loose for months, and every small act brought us closer in ways that words couldn't. She'd stand beside me, watching, her perfume drifting faintly between us. That evening, just before sunset, she asked if I could check a window lock in her room. "It keeps sticking," she said, her tone casual, but her eyes carried that quiet hesitance again, the same one from the night before. Her room was filled with soft golden light, the air warm and faintly scented with lavender. I knelt near the window, working on the latch, feeling her presence behind me. When I turned to ask for a screwdriver, she was standing closer than I expected, close enough for me to feel the brush of her breath against the back of my neck. I froze. She didn't move. For a heartbeat, everything hung still, the air, the sound, the world. Then she stepped back slightly, her eyes meeting mine. "Sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to startle you." But her voice trembled ever so slightly. It wasn't fear, it was something else. Something neither of us could pretend wasn't there anymore. I fixed the window in silence, aware of her watching me the entire time. When I finished, she smiled, small, almost fragile. "Thank you, you should rest. You've helped enough for one day." I nodded, unsure what to say. As I left her room, I caught her reflection in the mirror, her hand pressed lightly against her chest, as if steadying her heartbeat. That night, I lay awake, the memory of her closeness replaying in loops, her scent, her voice, the tremor in her tone. There were no words between us, but something had shifted, something unspoken but undeniable. It wasn't attraction in its simplest form. It was something deeper. The quiet realization that two lives, once parallel, had begun to lean toward each other, slowly, impossibly, inevitably. The days that followed the unspoken shift were heavy with tension I couldn't name. Every glance lingered a fraction longer. Every casual touch carried weight, and every silence seemed full of things we weren't saying. I found myself hyper-aware of her presence. The way she moved, the scent of her perfume lingering even after she left the room, the gentle cadence of her voice when she spoke my name. Then came the evening that changed everything. I had been planning to leave after my lease ended, the rational decision. I knocked on her door to tell her, rehearsing my words, trying to sound casual. When she opened, her expression faltered for the first time since I'd arrived. "You're leaving?" she asked, her voice soft, almost incredulous. I nodded. "It's just a lease. Nothing personal." She laughed lightly, but it didn't reach her eyes. She stepped back and gestured toward the living room. "Seat." I obeyed, feeling a nervous energy coil in my chest. We sat on the couch, the evening light dim and soft. She poured 2 glasses of wine, the clinking of glass breaking the heavy silence. She handed me a glass, her fingers brushing mine, this time deliberate, her touch lingering a moment longer. My heart thumped, though I tried to focus on the warmth of the wine. "I don't want you to go," she admitted suddenly, her voice low, almost fragile. It wasn't demanding or desperate, just honest. Her eyes searched mine, unflinching, and in them I saw a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. I swallowed. I didn't realize it meant that much to you." Her hand found mine on the couch, steady but warm. "It's not just about the lease," she said softly. "It's this. Us. This quiet rhythm we've built. Don't leave it behind." For a moment, words failed me. I wanted to say something clever, something rational, but the truth was impossible to deny. She was right. Something had shifted between us, subtle at first, then undeniable. Something that wasn't about rules or logic, but about presence, comfort, and connection. Her eyes softened as she continued. "Forget the lease, stay tonight instead." It was an invitation, not a command. A choice, not an obligation. And somehow, in those words, I felt a weight lift. The tension, the hesitation, the walls we'd both been holding up, all of it thinned in that one quiet sentence. I watched her pour more wine, the candlelight flickering across her features. She leaned slightly closer, just enough that the warmth of her arm brushed mine. It wasn't bold. It wasn't improper. It was human, comforting, vulnerable, honest. We sat in silence for a few moments, our hands lightly touching, the storm of emotions unspoken but electric in the air. Outside, the city lights shimmered faintly through the window, but inside, the world had shrunk to this room, to this quiet understanding that had grown between us. She rested her head on my shoulder, not demanding, not seeking, just leaning. And for the first time, I realized that staying wasn't about a lease at all. It was about choosing this, choosing her, choosing this connection, choosing the warmth that had grown between us without words, without ceremony, without urgency. That night, the house wasn't just a home anymore. It was ours, fragile, unspoken, perfect in its quiet intimacy. Morning arrived, soft and golden, spilling through the windows like a quiet benediction. The air in the house was still, carrying the faint scent of rain from the night before, mingling with the lingering warmth of last night's candlelight and wine. I woke to the muted sounds of her moving about downstairs, a gentle clatter of dishes, the faint hum of a tune she always seemed to sing without thinking. For the first time since I moved in, the house didn't feel like someone else's. It didn't feel like a temporary stop or a rented space. It felt lived in, alive, comforting, and it felt ours. I descended the stairs quietly, careful not to disturb her rhythm. She was in the kitchen, sunlight catching the strands of her hair as she stirred something in a pan. The way she moved was effortless, graceful, precise, yet unassuming. She glanced up, and her eyes softened when they met mine. "Good morning," she said softly, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Morning," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, though my chest felt full in a way I hadn't expected. She handed me a cup of tea, and we sat at the table in companionable silence. There was no need for conversation. The room itself was a kind of language we both understood now. Every glance, every subtle shift in posture, every faint touch. It was communication more powerful than words. At one point, she reached across the table to adjust my cup, her fingers brushing mine lightly. The sensation sent an echo of warmth through me, and I noticed the way her hand lingered a second longer than necessary, as if testing the air between us. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. We talked briefly, quietly about trivial things, the weather, the city waking up outside, plans for the day, but underneath it all was something else. A mutual recognition that our lives had intertwined in ways neither of us could have anticipated. She paused, her gaze falling to her hands. Then, in that soft, understated way she said, "You make this house feel like home again." I felt the weight of those words, simple yet profound. "You make it hard to ever leave," I said, and the honesty in my voice surprised me as much as it did her. She smiled, and for the first time, there was no hesitation, no flicker of uncertainty, just quiet warmth. She leaned back slightly, her fingers brushing mine on the table one last time before letting go. The gesture was fleeting, but it spoke volumes, trust, affection, and the fragile joy of two hearts slowly discovering their place together. Outside, the city moved on as it always did, unaware of the small revolution happening in that quiet house. Inside, the storm from last night was nothing more than a memory, a backdrop to a new rhythm, one of intimacy, comfort, and unspoken promises. We moved through the morning together, unhurried, savoring the ease of shared space, the soft laughter, and the subtle touches that had become our new language. It wasn't a dramatic climax, nor a grand confession. It was a gentle, undeniable truth. Two lives, once separate, had found a rhythm together. And in that quiet, sunlit morning, I realized something I couldn't have put into words the night before. This connection, this warmth, this quiet closeness was home. No lease, no rules, no obligations. Just us slowly discovering what it meant to be present for one another.